Okay, let's get this started. So hello everyone. So welcome to the fifth in our meetup series. My name is Ben Attal. I'm from the London Hub core team. We have a really exciting presentation today. It'll be for roughly an hour, but we have food and drinks as well. Outside, I see many of you already had yours, but there'll be food and drinks afterwards as well. A little bit before we get into the presentation about the SI London Hub. So essentially, let's go back. So essentially why we set up the hub was to bring people together to connect them and build capacity around achieving and advancing systems level innovation. This is the fifth in our meetup series, and this event specifically is to connect and bring people together for shared learning, but also around particular themes and topics. Why we believe the actual hub itself is important is because a lot of the challenges that we are now facing in our world require a new way of thinking and being. They have evaded a lot of the traditional ways that we have approached challenges and problems, and that's increasingly accelerating over time as well. So the case is now, and we really believe that systems thinking really represents that approach that is different to what we have done before. It's beyond just shared learning. It's really building that platform for collaborative capacity to go forward. Essentially, how we do this is in three ways. We have specific learning events, we have connecting events, as you see here, and then finally creating events. Each has a different purpose and a different stream. We currently sit within this connecting event here, trying to bring people together for particular topics. So that's essentially how, in a nutshell, we are bringing people together, building understanding and awareness, but also creating approaches and projects to advance that systems level innovation in London and also in the broader UK. There's other hubs in different parts of the world, but we specifically are for London and the broader UK. It's why we're really excited today to welcome Lydia. That's going to be talking about building that systems change strategy from scratch. We have a virtual audience here as well, but we're really excited about the interactive elements that we'll have both in person and hopefully virtually. And if all things go well, it'll be a fantastic event where hopefully you can meet new connections and start some conversations. So with that being said, Lydia, I think the floor is yours.
Yeah. Great, thanks Ben, thanks Josh for the invitation. Great to see you all, meet you all. Hello folks on Zoom, I hope that you'll feel included and able to participate in the next hour as well. As you might have gathered from the slide previously, I've spent the last 4 years trying to figure out how the heck do we create systems change in finance, in the financial system. I wrote on my name tag as I came in, not a finance person. So I didn't come to systems change in finance from working in the finance sector. Can I get a show of hands though, who worked in the financial system or finance sector at the moment? See how many. Yes, great, insiders, welcome. And if you're on Zoom, feel free to type in the chat to let us know that you're working in finance as well. So I came to this work from doing capacity building and leadership development work for change makers. So that was social entrepreneurs, purpose-driven business people, charities. How do we build change makers' capacity to influence change, as well as field building work in the social enterprise ecosystem and the impact investment ecosystem. And from doing that work, I became to get a little bit unsettled. Something intuitively within me felt this can't be the silver bullet for solving all of the world's problems. There's these fantastic folks out there who are really working to alleviate social and environmental issues. But I felt that a lot of it was a bit like popping a pimple, where you might pop the pimple, but the underlying reason that why we might be getting pimples in the first place, eating too much sugar, hormonal imbalances, whatever it might be, was still there and not quite being addressed. And so that was what sort of, I guess, intuitively drew me to the systems innovation space. And when I started to ask, well, what are some of those underlying patterns, underlying drivers of these various social and environmental issues that we now have all of these sustainable development goals to try to address, I came across how money works, how our economies are structured. There we go. As as one of the underlying drivers. So when I moved to London 5 years ago, I started asking around, who are the people who are really challenging the paradigm of our economies and finance, why they're here, what they're for, how they work, who's thinking about that and figuring out how we practically change it. And that's where I came across Finance Innovation Lab, which I'll tell you about in a bit. That's where I've been doing this work for the past few years. But in more recent times, I actually came across the phrase, I think it might have come from one of the SI resources, the difference between dissolving problems versus solving problems. So social entrepreneurs are often trying to solve problems. And what I'm really interested in is how do we dissolve the very patterns that give rise to those problems in the first place? And I fundamentally believe that that is the work that we need to do. And just has been introduced to this way of addressing challenges, and it is different to what might not be working from the past. So I come to the social innovation space hoping to use my skills in developing humans, developing people, and building fields and ecosystems to contribute to systems innovation. That's a bit about how I've come to be in this space. So I'd love to just spend a moment perhaps with us checking in with each other. If you were to turn to somebody who perhaps you don't know so well, or you haven't had this question from this evening, how would you say in about a minute you have come to the social innovation world? It might be tonight, it might be your first time. What's brought you here? It might be you've been here for a little while. So turn to someone next to you, just share in a minute, and I'll let you know when to swap over. What brings you to social innovation? And on Zoom, please pop in the chat. What brings you to the world of social innovation, and see who's in the room.
Oh, sorry.
I must have went from okay. We need to reset now.
Yeah, so I'm center for environmental participation
So swapping over if you haven't already.
Okay, cool.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Wrapping up. Thank you very much. Hopefully you learned something new about somebody else in the room. Great to see a varied group joining us on Zoom as well. Thanks for being here. So as I mentioned, I had this sort of inquiry within me of how might we address some of these underlying patterns that are producing social and environmental issues. And I was so stoked when I came across Finance Innovation Lab. The lab is a charity here in the UK, working for a financial system that serves people and planets. And I really connected with the origin story of the organisation. So initially it was started by WWF UK, so the environmental charity, and the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. So a bit of an unlikely pairing. But the WWF team, their corporate partnerships team, was going to banks and asking for support to fund work on things like deforestation and water sanitation. And while the bank was giving them some funds to help do that work, they could see that banks were giving inordinately more money to the companies that were polluting the waterways and that were chopping down the forests to create these problems in the first place. So they started to think, well, what would it look like to actually change finance and where the money's going, rather than do the work of mopping up the problems that are being caused. And at the time, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, their sustainability team, were asking similar questions. So they came together around this big question: how can we build a financial system that serves people and planet? And one thing that I want to make really clear at the basis of all of Finance Innovation Lab's work is that finance is fundamentally a complex human system. So I don't know about you, but when I first came to working on finance, I thought it's a hugely technical system. I don't understand how all the things work, all the derivatives, all the things that created the financial crisis. It feels really dense and impossible to shift. It feels huge. It can feel really locked in place. But if we think about finance as a complex human system, it's fundamentally about a bunch of ideas that we've all consented to, that if I hold up a £1 coin, we all agree that that means something and can be exchanged for something else. That doesn't mean it's easy to change, but it does mean it's a human system. People made it, and so people can change it. And so that's where I've taken a very human-centered approach to shifting the financial system. And when I came on board 4 years ago with Finance Innovation Lab, their work was at a certain point. So some of you might be familiar with this. This is the two loops model from the Berkana Institute. And the top loop, the blue one, represents our incumbent system, slowly losing its fit for purpose. So mainstream finance, if you like, the dominant regime. And the black loop coming up from the bottom represents a new emerging system of influence, an alternative possibility for the financial system. So when I joined the lab was very much focused on the black loop. So naming those innovators that were demonstrating alternatives of how finance could be and what's possible, connecting them in networks with one another, similar to what SI Hub's doing with systems innovation, and then nourishing them in communities of practice where they can learn from one another and then grow their influence. So we were illuminating what this new possibility looks like so it could become an emerging system. And so at that point, Finance Innovation Lab was starting to say, well, we're doing this work, but what role might we play in where the bulk of capital and people and employees, etc., sits in mainstream finance? What role might we be able to play in transitioning parts of the mainstream that are great and that we need in this new system of influence? It's not about getting it all out of the way, but what patterns within the mainstream do we need to hospice out of the system and compost so that we can regenerate those nutrients and use them in other ways in our new financial system. So that was the question, really. And so I was fortunate enough to be recruited to figure out with a blank slate, where the heck do we start? And so we ended up identifying a leverage point to start at. So a leverage point being somewhere where we could create some small changes that would ripple out to create some shifts across the system. And we ended up deciding to start somewhere that matched where Finance Innovation Lab's existing capabilities and networks lay, but also where there was some latent energy for change. And that was at the intersection of mainstream banking, the climate crisis, and employee advocates. So we chose mainstream banking because when was this, 2018, at that point, there was a lot more happening in the world of investments and pensions and the like, sustainable investment, impact investing, and not so much happening in mainstream banking around shifting it in purpose-driven ways. But banking has a huge impact on what we call the real economy, so the economy that we live in every day. banks have the power to say what companies, what individuals get funded and what grows and what doesn't. So we knew we could have a tremendous impact there. We chose the climate crisis because, well, A, it's extremely urgent and we need all hands on deck to address it. But also banks were open to taking action on climate at that point. They still are today. The UK government was around that time setting its NDC 2050, net zero by 2050. The regulation and policy was starting to come into play. And so banks are starting to go, oh, what do we do about this climate thing? But I do want to say that the climate crisis, I believe, is a symptom, another symptom of broken systems. It's not the problem in and of itself. And so I was a little bit resistant to starting with climate as a focus, because I thought, oh, if we focus there, we might get banks to get out of fossil fuels and start investing in great alternatives, but we wouldn't fundamentally transform finance. We'd have to start back at square one with biodiversity, racial injustice, whatever it might be. But if we can use the climate crisis to get down to those root causes of why banks finance these things in the first place, we could change those things that flows on to impact other social environmental issues too. So that was where we started, and the question that we formed around this was how might we repattern mainstream banking through the power of employee advocates addressing their bank's role in the climate crisis. And a little on employee advocates as well. We knew from our work that there were willing and active change makers inside banks who were wanting to be part of creating shifts, but perhaps were feeling isolated and like they didn't know anybody else who was, and it's such a big system, and what can I do? The Rockwell Institute calls these people insider outsiders, people on the inside with connections into the outside world who can help create those shifts. Nobody was really focusing on that though, so there's lots of climate campaigners doing really great stuff, trying to shift banks from the outside, trying to change policy and regulation. Not so many people were focused on how might we create change from the inside out. So that's also why we decided to focus there. So the process that we took to figure out how might we even do systems change in finance at this leverage point was this. Firstly, we focused on building a community. Who are these insiders? Who are these folks who are trying to create change? How might we connect them with one another? Secondly, we were testing interventions. So what could we test that might help them to connect with one another, build their knowledge, their networks, their confidence and their skills to influence greater change? And what can we learn about that, around how systems change, around what the barriers are that they're facing and how they might be overcome? And thirdly, we then let strategy emerge from what we were learning. So I can't understate the power of reflective practice in systems innovation. So intervening, planning what we're going to do after diagnosing the system, taking action, and then noticing what did we learn? What changes did we see in the system? What did we learn about ourselves as interveners? And then from that, strategy emerges. But really, I should have drawn this as a circular process as well. Because as we built our community, we came up with new interventions we could test, and new strategy emerged. So it keeps going round and round and round. But what we ended up testing and incorporating into our work came from a huge range of disciplines. There was system science, there was psychology, anthropology, spiritual practices, indigenous worldviews, organizational change, lots of different practices that are inherently systemic in nature came into this work. So a little on the community. This is my favorite part, because I got to meet incredible humans who are working in finance institutions who do not look anything like the Wolf of Wall Street banker that is the stereotype many of us might have in our minds. There are incredible humans inside finance. Banks are not monoliths. They're made up of people who exist on a spectrum, from somebody who feels like they have more in common with an Extinction Rebellion campaigner who's glued their hand to their front office wall than many of their own colleagues, right down to people who might be perceived to be resistant to change and not wanting to do anything about the climate from within banking. But these people, we noticed while they were feeling disillusioned and like their personal values didn't match up with their corporate behaviours that they were being asked to perform, they weren't ready to quit. Incredibly brave, resilient people on the inside, thinking, how can I influence change? If all of the good guys, so to speak, leave, nobody shifts this giant behemoth. They They felt isolated though and powerless because of that. In banking culture in particular, it's so fast paced. You're trying to meet your targets all the time. People often don't have time or permission to talk about what they care about. So they don't know that there are other people like them on the inside. Sometimes you can identify them from their LinkedIn profile, but not always. They don't always have sustainability manager as their job title. These are people from people who are credit risk analysts who are trying to figure out how can we incorporate climate risk into how we assess whether we give money to something or not. It's HR people who are thinking, if we're going to do culture change, how can we introduce making decisions based on culture into our organization? So they're all over the place and at all levels of seniority. So we called them climate intrapreneurs. And we didn't so much, or we don't so much mean intrapreneurs in the way we often hear it spoken about. So somebody inside perhaps a large corporate who's designed a new product or service that can help meet a market opportunity. This was about a systemic form of entrepreneurship. So these are people who were trying to change the core strategy, operations, and culture of their institution. So it goes so much deeper than products or services alone. And one of the things we noticed was simply naming these people gave them huge amounts of confidence and power. They'd go, oh my God, there are people like me. This is a thing to care about this and to be trying to do this inside my bank. I think if we were to do nothing else, the single biggest intervention was just creating community and helping these people meet each other. And they're across different banks, right? And some of them in the same bank. And when we would bring them into a room, we'd create the Chatham House rules. So it was a confidential space. It was called what we call fully competitive space. So there's lots of rules around what bankers are and aren't allowed to talk to people from other banks about because of not wanting to be colluding on things. But we created a space where they were able to talk about how you convince your boss to take action on something. What are some of the barriers you're facing in trying to create change? And one of the things that was really important about this was the countercultural environment that we created. So banking, fast-paced, competitive, lots of hierarchy, lots of power over rather than power with. And so we really intentionally created an environment that was what I would call rehearsing the future. So rehearsing the culture that we felt that banks should be if they were to serve the purpose of serving people and planet. So that those entrepreneurs could feel that and experience that and iterate that with us and then take that back into their banks to create change. So that was a bit about the community. And then we tested interventions. So what is it that enabled change within these institutions and helped the entrepreneurs to do it? And one thing that was a really important grounding premise for us is that at the root of so many of the societal and planetary crises we face is disconnection. Disconnection from self, disconnection from others, and disconnection from nature. We can see this in our language. Even on one of my slides at the beginning, I talked about a financial system that serves people and planet, as if people are not planet, as if we are not just nature observing itself. People are planets, but our Western Enlightenment thinking so often, particularly in banking, hyper-analytical culture, makes us separate things into parts and to think that the parts are more fundamental than the relationships between them. But we wanted to test what interventions could be used to restore relationships with ourselves, with others, and with this planetary biosphere that we are fundamentally a part of. So a systems innovation framework that was really helpful for this is the idea of panarchy. So the idea that change can happen at multiple scales, that we have cycles of birth and growth and renewal happening at different scales in a system. And change happens faster at those smaller, more local scales, but it knocks on and impacts the scales that are a bit further up. And so we decided to take a fractal-based approach, thinking about these different scales in this work. And these were the fractals or the scales that we worked with. We worked at the level of the individual, so the climate entrepreneur themselves, and restoring connection with self. We looked at the level of the interpersonal, so the climate entrepreneur's connections with others within their institution. The organizational level, so what does a bank need to do to change as an organization? How does it change? excuse me, and the system level. So the financial system is not the same as the financial sector. Financial sector of all the bunch of institutions, but we all participate in the financial system every day. Every time we make a purchase, our pension, our insurance, all of that, the government participates in it, local communities, civil society organizations, the financial system is very broad. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the interventions that we tested at each of these scales. So at the individual level, this is around the climate entrepreneur. The types of questions that we were supporting them to explore are, how do I relate to the climate crisis? I know Robin Alfred is on Zoom, who is somebody who supported us in this work, looking at where do I feel the climate crisis within me? Is it something that is out there? Is it something that I think about in my head, or is it something that I feel embodied within me? Do I feel connected to it or disconnected? To what extent am I connected with myself? If my body is the vessel with which I do this work, but we're running around in a disembodied system, just thinking, is that going to enable us to do it? And this comes into contact with the world of psychology and trauma. If trauma is frozen parts within us, where at some point in our lives we've had too much too fast coming that we've had to freeze a part of our inner worlds in order to survive, we can't host that part within us until we do some work to unfreeze it, which makes it really hard to host those patterns that we see at the bigger levels of the system within us. So really thinking about that inner work for outer change. And the final question that we wanted to support entrepreneurs with is, what is mine to do? No single person or organization can change the entire financial system, right? So what is my leverage point? What is it that I am uniquely placed to do with my skills, my networks, my relationships, in order to create a shift that's joined up with other people who also know what is mine to do? The interventions we tried around this were individual coaching of these people, peer-to-peer coaching. We supported a number of them, or encouraged a number of them to seek out their own therapy because they were keen to do some of that in the work. Mindfulness and meditation. Would you believe it? We had bankers in a room and we were meditating with them. And they found that completely useful, because in such a fast-paced culture, just being able to step back and reflect and to re-diagnose and go, okay, what am I doing now? That was really important for them. So creating that spaciousness, supporting them to develop comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity when banking culture is analysis, let's mitigate all of the risks. How do we let go of that when we're working in non-linear ways? So it all comes back to this quote that I'm sure you've seen before around systems leadership. The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So that self level is really important in the work. So I'll take you now to the interpersonal layer. So this is often when we get these climate entrepreneurs in a room, so much what they'd be asking us is, how do I shift mindsets? How do I build buy-in? How do I get my CEO to care about this or take action on this? And also, how can I transform power dynamics within my bank, where the people who have the say, and there's other people who don't have a say but perhaps should. So some of the ways that we work with both mindsets and power dynamics is we developed something called a power mapping canvas. So we had entrepreneurs map people in their organization along a level of the horizontal axis of vision alignment or values alignment. How much do you feel this person is aligned with you in terms of what you're trying to do, in terms of banks financing a just and regenerative future rather than climate breakdown? So plot them. And then on the vertical axis, what level of power do they hold? And we use the Rockwell Institute 4 lenses of power for this as well. So we looked at not just hard power or formal power, but soft power. So much of what happens in these banking institutions is via navigating the informal channels of influence and politics around it. And so they then ended up seeing their network in terms of their allies on the right-hand side, and perhaps you might call them their influencing targets on the left-hand side. And there are a couple of things that they could do. One is, when it comes to their allies, how might we build collective power with other entrepreneurs in our bank? So while we were doing that work with entrepreneurs across lots of banks, we were supporting them to identify other climate entrepreneurs in their institution across all different parts who might have different levels of power, and figure out how do we build shared power. So the difference between power over and power with was really important here. So banks have a strong culture of power over. So I have a role or a position or some form of power, and so I'm able to make you do what I want. Whereas power with is when we have a shared vision that we're all working towards. And so we were helping these entrepreneurs to connect with these people, empower them, and activate them to create change in their bank. And my favorite definition of systems leadership is this one by Marshall Gans, who's a community organizer in the US. So he says that leadership is accepting responsibility to create the conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. So leadership isn't follow me, do what I do, I'm doing it. It's creating the conditions for us to have shared power with and achieve that together. And secondly, the second way that we used, this is around raising vision alignment. So when you've got somebody perhaps who holds a position of power who isn't on board with it, who the chief risk officer, for example, doesn't want to incorporate climate risk into the way the bank makes lending decisions, what do you do then? How do you increase that buy-in? And one thing that I learned through this work, excuse me, is I don't like shifting mindsets as a term, because shifting mindsets implies power over. I'm going to force you to change your mind and to think what I think. So we did a lot of work around what does it look like to build this vision alignment in a way that's invitational, in a way that's building power with. And one thing we found is thinking about unmet needs is really important. When you've got somebody who feels like they're way down this end of the spectrum, they're resistant to change, they're a huge barrier, how do you work with that? Coming to them with a posture of empathy and curiosity was something that worked really well for climate entrepreneurs. So building relationships of trust with these people, where you could then discover why is it that they don't want to take the action that I want them to. And usually it's because they fear a need that's currently being met by the status quo, not being met if the system was to change. What does that mean? I am working in banking because I need the income to provide for my family. My motivations are my family. I've got investors breathing down my neck, and I fear that if I don't make certain decisions, they're going to pull out from the company, and I'm incentivized based on share price, for example. What is it that they fear? And then how can you work with them to identify how they might be able to meet that need and the course of action that you're working towards? So that was really, really massive for entrepreneurs. And it enabled them to be a critical friend as well. So it doesn't mean just pandering and saying, oh, it's okay, I'm just going to be nice. There is a role for challenge and accountability. But to do that in a way where you have a relationship of trust enables you to say what we call a connected no, as opposed to a disconnected no. So it comes back to connection again, right? Disagreeing with somebody, shaming somebody because they're doing the wrong thing, that creates disconnection in a relationship. There are ways we can say no, campaign advocacy in ways that remain connected, but still invite them to take accountability. The productive zone of disequilibrium. This is a favorite tool of mine. This comes from adaptive leadership. So I do love a graph, as you can tell, lots of these are graphs. But essentially what this is saying is people don't feel safe to change if they feel attacked, if they feel shamed, if they feel like their level of safety is been reduced too much, they then shut down. They don't change. That's up here. It's above their limit of tolerance. People also don't change if they feel too comfortable. Again, status quo is working for them. Why should I take action? So entrepreneurs have to do a lot of work around keeping people in the zone of transformation. How do you raise the level of discomfort so much that they want to take action, but not so much that people feel unsafe? So this brings us to the organizational level. The practical, what does a bank actually need to do with its strategy and its lending and investment to align with climate goals? And how does change happen in a large institution like that? So here's the first, a simple way to imagine the first one. The practical things around climate that a bank needs to do is get out of fossil fuels ASAP, yesterday. Get into more green finance, start financing the alternative energy sources that we need to replace them. And then all the other banks lending and investment, all these other types of companies and individuals and sectors support those clients and companies to transition their own business models so that they align with net zero. That's the sort of high level. But if you think about the iceberg model, the classic systems change iceberg model, I would call that at the events level, above the waterline, right? So we converted the iceberg model into a tree with bankers to explain that the strategies, the lending and investment activities that we've just talked about, excuse me, are at the top of the tree. This is the branches of the tree, I'm sorry, the leaves of the tree. What enables those and determines where the money goes is the branches of the trees that hold the leaves up, right? These are the organizational structures. So this is everything from like organizational design. Does the sustainability team report in to the chief marketing officer? So therefore sustainability is a bit more likely to be a greenwashing activity. Or does the sustainability team report straight into the CEO's office because it's a core business priority right now? Things like policies. Does the company have a policy around whether they will or won't lend to coal or to oil and gas, for example? And incentives. How are staff in the bank incentivized to act? Are they incentivized to just maximize short-term return no matter what they're lending to? So that's where a lot of that sits at the branches. But then if we come down to the trunk level, remember, finance is a human system. Organizations are made up of people. So this comes back to relationships and power dynamics. Who's connected to who in the organization? Where are their silos? How does power work? This is where equity, diversity, and inclusion is key. What lived experience of the climate crisis is represented in our decision making and in our strategies. What are the communication styles? All of that. We need to work with that too as climate entrepreneurs. And then we come right down to the roots, which is of course the bottom of the iceberg, that mental models layer. So challenging the very paradigm of what is a bank for in society? Why do we have it? What do we believe is possible within our banks? What are the values and mindsets and assumptions that underpin how we design these organizations? So that was at that level. And some of the interventions that we tried to help climate entrepreneurs work with this was peer learning, learning from each other. How are you trying to create change? How are you trying to create change? That really helps. Access to experts in our community. So those people at that black loop that I talked about at the very beginning who are demonstrating the alternatives, bringing them into banks to help them understand what they might be able to do differently, sharing reports because they were all overwhelmed with so much information coming at them every day. So that's the organizational layer. So the final layer is the financial system layer. Remember, financial system, not financial sector. And so the questions that entrepreneurs are asking there is, what does the system I'm part of even look like? So banking professionals are incredibly specialized. You're a risk person, you're an IT person, you're an HR person, and it's hard for them to even imagine what their overall bank looks like, let alone the banking system. So helping the system sense and see itself was really massive. Secondly, what external changes need to happen to enable change within a bank? So there are some things that even if every single person inside a bank agreed that it should happen, that change couldn't happen because something outside it needed to shift first, regulation, for example, or policy, or other banks needed to do it at the same time. So the final question was, what external changes across the banking system could my bank influence? So banks do a lot of lobbying, right? And at the moment, it's been lobbying against the type of regulation that would see them stop financing fossil fuels. What if they were to use their lobbying power to say, hey, we would all like to do this, all of us banks, but we need the rules to make it happen because none of us want to do it first. It's too risky. So how could they be influencing externally? So one last thing on this financial system layer, this is what it looks like when we tried to map the system around climate. These are the different actors. Excuse me, I've clearly been talking too long. These are the different actors that have the ability to influence a bank. Everything from investor pressure to these various industry commitments that banks are signing on to and saying we're going to do this, we're not going to do that. Public campaigners, Extinction Rebellion and the like, the media, there's all sorts that can impact on the outside what's going on inside a bank. We were one of the founding members of a network called the Climate Safe Lending Network, where we brought together these different actors to look at helping the system see itself, but also what's the nature of the relationships between those different actors and how might we start to transform them. And one thing that I found particularly interesting was the relationship between climate campaigners and climate entrepreneurs or bankers. So this is called the drama triangle, classic 1960s psychology framework, which is some roles that we often get ourselves stuck in, persecutor, victim, and rescuer. And something that I noticed is that bankers and campaigners were stuck in a persecutor victim dynamic, where the campaigners were saying we're the victims, or the world is the victims, we're being persecuted by these banks that are investing in things that are killing us. And then the bankers were saying, no, we're the victims. These campaigners are coming at us and slamming us, and we're feeling attacked left, right, and center about things that we're trying really hard to change, but there's just certain things getting in the way. And that relationship wasn't really working. Both entities were shutting down and not really understanding each other. So we hosted some spaces where we brought some trusted climate campaigners and some climate entrepreneurs into the same space to build understanding of one another. And what happened in that session was the campaigners thought, oh, there are some people who share my vision and values inside the banks. Maybe they could help me understand what our tactics should be on the outside to really influence change. So they started talking to one another and sharing information. And then the bankers were like, oh, these people are not just super passionate people who have no idea how climate work, how banking works. They understand our system. Some of them are ex-bankers themselves. How could we give them access to, or ask them to put pressure on the right places, so that something I'm trying to shift inside my bank is more likely to happen because the pressure is also coming in from the outside in the right places. So bringing together and restoring that relationship really helps at that system layer to unlock some new activity within the system. And that is all of the fractals. I won't go through this, but just wanted to say that I noticed these fractals working within me as well. So as an intervener in the system, I had to connect with myself and understand my lenses and be self-aware. My team, we had to figure out how are we modeling the type of culture that we think should be in banks so that we host that for our community. My organization, how is Finance Innovation Lab a prototype for the type of organizations we think should exist in the financial system, everything from trialing a 4-day work week to how we do HR and hiring practices. And then at the system level, challenging the funding of systems change work, getting grant funders to value systems change work, which is long-term and really hard to measure in traditional ways. So we were doing our own systems change in our own system while climate entrepreneurs were doing theirs. So that was the interventions that we tested. And then the last thing I want to show you is the strategy that emerged. So the thing that we wanted banks to do was set rigorous climate targets and the transition plans that would help them achieve them. And then ultimately transform their banks to achieve those targets, but transform it right down the tree, not just at that surface level. So we worked with 3 groups to do this. The climate entrepreneurs, we built high trust relationships and we built their capacity to influence change. And so they would influence change in 2 ways. They would directly do the change down the bottom, and they would also influence power holders within their banks to take action where they couldn't. Then we gained some really important strategic learning from the climate entrepreneurs. What are the barriers to change inside a bank? How does change happen inside a bank? And we share that information with external bank influencers, always anonymously. So we'd never throw any banker under the bus. We'd always share the patterns that we were noticing internally. For example, to campaigners to say, hey, if you were to do a campaign targeting this bank in this kind of way, that bank's probably ready to sit on this issue and it would probably be achieved. And then those external bank influencers, again, would get power holders to take action based on the things they care about. And the last thing we experimented with is, do we have a role directly influencing some of those power holders that are at the left-hand side of that power mapping canvas, that are less aligned, that are not climate entrepreneurs? And we found that, yes, we did. We formed what we called strategic partnerships with 2 banks, where we worked with their senior leaders to help them understand what does being a just, regenerative, sustainable bank look like. Brought in the CEO of Triodos Bank, for example, to speak to them about how do you do this in practice? How is it different in this kind of a bank compared to this one? As they went on that journey, because the senior leadership had some openness to it. And that's the latest part of the strategy that we're still experimenting with. So that is my brain dump of the work that we did over the past 4 years. My sort of final thing as a systems leader is to recognize when it's time to move on. So I started that work and built it up over time, and have now in September left it in the hands of an incredible team of 8 who are continuing the work. And so now I'm moving into consulting and helping other people with their own systems change strategies across different systems, but feeling really proud of where it got to. And this has been a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect and share some of the things that I learned. So thank you for creating the space to do that. What I'd love to do now is invite you to experience one of the things that we did with bankers. And this is a reflection and integration practice. So if you feel comfortable, just get a little bit comfortable in your seat. You might want to put your feet on the ground. And if we could set up the breakout rooms while we're doing that. So depending on what you feel comfortable with, you can either lower your gaze to the floor or close your eyes. And just take some deep breaths. Breathing in through your nose. A big sigh out altogether. Another breath in. Big sigh out. Just start to notice different parts of your body. Feel your feet on the floor. Perhaps your back of your thighs against the chair, your back against the chair. What do you notice in your body? Starts to feel alive, relaxed. Starts to feel a bit stiff, a bit tight. And then direct your awareness to your emotional space or your heart space. Having heard that brain dump of information, what is it that you're feeling or noticing within you emotionally? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you fizzing over a particular thing? What emotions are you noticing? And then direct your awareness to your thoughts. Imagine them on a conveyor belt going past you, across your mind and out again. What are you noticing there? How fast is your conveyor belt going? And then finally turning to where for you your source of inspiration might come from, your source of the whispers of the future, something outside yourself, something greater than yourself. Some people, this might be imagining a beam of light coming into the crown of their heads, or is it tingling sensations or a general sense? What whispers of the future are you picking up on after hearing what you've heard? What seeds are wanting to be born in our financial system or in your world? And then when you're ready, taking a deep breath in together and letting it out. You can open your eyes now. Just thinking about the things that came up for you there, things you're noticing in your body, your heart space, and your mind, whispers of the future. We're going to take a moment now to get into threes, perhaps without some people you haven't spoken with yet, and just share for a few minutes what's coming up for you this evening. What did you notice? What's coming up for you after hearing this presentation? We've probably got about 7 minutes just to share and things that are coming up for you in trios. And if you're on Zoom, we'll be adding you into a breakout room to have a chat. See you soon. Can you put the lights on?
Cinema. Really good.
Oh, thank you.
Always trying to like remain it's going we actually asked them to put it up and literally so many of them have done it. Oh, sure.
They like turn off together.
Hopefully, yeah.
So we're wanting to be done by half past, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's like a few minutes over.
Okay, yeah, so I'll give them maybe till half past chat, and then I'll just do a few minutes if anybody wants to share a couple of things that came up, and then I'll
Perfect.
yeah, great.
Yeah, we're about to get too many questions. So that's right. You went right.
No, that's fine. How many people have been on the call? Yeah, they were like, it's done now, I'm out.
I kind of think so.
Yeah, it's like, nobody told me this was participatory. Yeah, me too. Depends on the day, doesn't it?
I guess I want to write that unspoken lie and so you would have actually having house sisters I suppose strategies is that
Correspondence.
There's something there. Yeah,
And then if you bring the slide back. Thank you for all of your thoughts, feelings, senses that you shared just then. We're going to wrap up in a moment so we can head out into the much cooler space that we're in now and have some drinks and nibbles. But I'd just love to get a sense of a couple of things that might have come up in your conversation. And if you were on Zoom, please pop some into the chat. It'd be great to get a sense of what your conversations were. But would anybody feel comfortable to share what is something that came up in your conversation that sparked something for you? Lovely to hear.
We were talking about the role in terms of being a test bed or a living lab or an intervener in a system in terms of steering the conversation to maybe see the dominant thinking around the space versus letting ideas surface and emerge, what those kind of ethical considerations and tensions are in terms of the learning, the intervention, and the change process versus the more emergent, incremental change that might happen more slowly in an organization. So.
Oh, I'd love to chew that over with you afterwards. There's something like power dynamics in there too, right? Like who gets to say what should happen? Yeah.
It's like that whole idea of this curated content, and that's one of the things that I think is circulating in the policy world is experts have drawn conclusions, and then they do dialogue and engagement with stakeholders to validate their predetermined pathways rather than actually listen to stakeholders and see if there are other forms of evidence and other voices that can be incorporated to have more socially relevant interventions. But that opens up a whole other can of worms that maybe doesn't want to be listened to.
Yeah, thank you for that. What else came up in your conversations? I won't comment on everything everybody says as well, so don't worry about that. One or two more.
Something that's always on my mind is quite who pays for this. Is that a problem of the system itself? But unfortunately, it's the system we live in. So how does this actually happen?
And do we need to change the paradigm of what payment means and how business cases are defined? Or because if we don't, are we iterating within the current paradigm, right?
And let's use that first step, which is what I like about the community part, because that's everyone works together, but what are we all doing?
Yeah.
It's like the fear of moving, don't know, but do know, don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Is there anything in the chat, Ben, from Zoom?
Yes, one question from Robin, like what lies beyond systems transformation? Is it field thinking, sensing transformation? A very open-ended question.
Yeah, I mean, I think Robin should answer that question himself because he's doing fantastic work in that, but certainly, yeah, in the way that I became disillusioned with social innovation and moved towards systems innovation, even the systems innovation system is continually changing. What is the new way of creating change that's emerging beyond that? Yeah, so check out Robin Alfred's work if you're keen to understand some of that, and there is plenty of other things going on as well. One more from the room before we wrap up. Anything that came out of the conversation, Joss?
Yeah, I'm really interested in talking about the kind of subtlety of the people in the system, right? And you bring together very different people who are normally kind of stereotyping each other, like the activists and the bankers, and you create a space where they're able to actually see the subtlety of all these bankers, right? What's inside bankers, and out you get all these different people, and that's the reality of it, right? And that creates huge opportunities then to connect them, doesn't it? They actually see each other as human beings and different potential, different ways that they can connect around that to create space for that to happen. I think that's a really key part of it. Just recognize the subtlety of what's going on, the kind of complex reality behind a bank. I think we've got a bank that's incredibly complex and subtle group of human beings, and then if you can deal with that, you can get into the idea of embracing complexity and working with complexity and diversity. If you can embrace that, then there's huge potential in that, like you're showing, to actually break down those stereotypes and connect them in all different ways, or start to see connections in all different ways to see each other's human beings build up over.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's been wonderful to be here with you. If you want to get in touch, you're very welcome to. I'm happy to connect you on with Finance Innovation Lab, Climate Safe Lending Network, or do get in touch yourself. Thanks for having me here, and I'll hand back to you, Ben.
Awesome. No, thank you, Lydia. So a really quick word, there's food and drinks outside. If you want to see more events like this, then please do check out the hub on Mighty Networks. Just message one of the team here or talk to us, and we'll send you all the relevant stuff there. Any feedback as well, we would love to learn about how we can create effective events. We like this one, but we still want to hear how we can make it better next time. But yeah, food and drink outside, guys, and thank you all for coming.